A True Picture of Emigration by Rebecca and Edward Burlend, Chapter 3. As I intimated in the preceding chapter, we reached New Orleans on Sunday morning, but when I came to survey the town more leisurely, I could scarcely believe it was the Lord's Day. I remembered that frequently on our passage I had heard it remarked that the time varied with the time in England a few hours, and for a moment I supposed that the Sabbath varied also. The reader will perceive the cause of my surprise when he is told that the shops were everywhere open, stalls set out in all directions, and the streets thronged with lookers-on, more in a manner of a fair than a Christian Sabbath. This, I was told, was the general method of spending that day in New Orleans. With regard to the inhabitants, their appearance was exceedingly peculiar, their complexions varying almost as much as their features, from the deep black of the flat-nosed Negro to the sickly pale hue of the American shopman. This city is a regular rendezvous for merchants and tradesmen of every kind, from all quarters of the globe. Slavery is here tolerated in its grossest forms. I observed several groups of slaves linked together in chains and driven about the streets like oxen under the yoke. The river, which is of immense width, affords a sight not less unique than the city. No one, except eyewitnesses, can form an adequate idea of the number and variety of vessels there collected, and lining the river for miles in length. New Orleans being the provision market for the West Indies and some of the southern states, its port is frequented not merely by foreign traders, but by thousands of small craft, often of the rudest construction, on which the settlers in the interior bring down the various produce of their climate and industry. Footnote. The flatboat commerce by which the surplus products of the upper Mississippi Valley was brought to New Orleans flourished for a generation or more, until the era of railroad construction, which immediately preceded the Civil War. An Illinois youth of recent adoption who made the long journey to New Orleans the year preceding Mrs. Burland's arrival in America bore the name of Abraham Lincoln. The journey he made was typical of thousands of similar ones performed in the period here alluded to. End of footnote. The town itself, from its low marshy situation, is very unhealthy. The yellow fever is an everlasting scourge to its inhabitants, annually carrying off great numbers. As a trading port, New Orleans is the most famous and the best situated of any in America, but whoever values a comfortable climate or a healthy situation will not, I am sure, choose to reside there. But to resume my narrative. Having arrived at the port, it was our intention to proceed immediately up the river to St. Louis, but as no steam vessel left till the next day, we remained on board in front of the town. The custom-house officers had not yet been on board to examine the ship, and as we had nothing for which duty would be required, our captain gave my husband a document to present to the inspectors, by which we were allowed to pass early the next morning. Before entering the steam vessel, we got the remainder of our money, all in English sovereigns, changed into American dollars. We found that our expenses since leaving home amounted to about 23 pounds. On leaving the ship, I felt a renewal of my homesickness. To use a quaint expression, it seemed to be the only remaining link between me and England. I was now going to be an alien among strangers. Hitherto I had been accompanied by persons who, when my pain on leaving home manifested itself, could sympathize with me. I should have preferred the meanest passenger on the ship to any I saw on the packet. As, however, we were all in haste to be on our way, I had little time to spend on those tender associations. I certainly left the ship with an aching heart. The captain and cabin passengers had been very kind to us during the voyage, and on going away my children were severally presented with small tokens of approbation, of which they were not a little proud. I must now leave the ship to pursue my route up the stream of the Mississippi to St. Louis, a distance of not less than 1,300 miles. The country on each side of the river is of a dead level, but to all appearance exceedingly productive, and cultivated with considerable pains. On account of the heat which prevails in these districts, the productions of tropical regions are here grown in great abundance. The extensive plantations, notwithstanding their flat appearance, are exceedingly beautiful, and if anything could have made me forget that I was an unsettled exile, the scenery of the country bordering this river must have done it. There was, nevertheless, one drawback. These beautiful plantations are cultivated by slaves, many of whom we saw as we passed along, as we had regularly to stop by the way to obtain timber for our fires, that being the fuel invariably used by the steamers on this river. We had frequent opportunities of stepping ashore. On one occasion, a passenger, seeing a negro smoking his pipe by his little cabin, was just at hand, took the liberty of going up to him for the purpose of begging a little fruit, which hung in plenty on the trees around. The negro without hesitation granted his request, and our hero immediately mounted a tree, which he partially stripped of its juicy burden. This little incident might have passed unnoticed, had not the intruder, on descending from the tree, made use of a kind of box which was underneath to break his fall. Its structure was too slender for so unusual a load, and in consequence he burst into the top, to the terror of the negro, who immediately darted across the orchard, leaving our companion to make the best of his misfortune. The latter was soon convinced that he had committed a blunder, as the box was a beehive, and its occupants, aware they had been insulted, would accept no apology, but drawing their sabers, attacked their foe with tremendous fury. Poor Yankee was no Leonidas, but with all the speed his heels could muster, he betook himself to the packet, where he was greeted with roars of laughter by his less enterprising associates. As we proceeded up the river, the country assumed a more rude and uncultivated appearance. The date and plantain tree of the lower regions was exchanged for majestic forest trees and untrodden wilds. Further down, it was delightfully pleasant. Here, magnificently grand eternal forest, in appearance as interminable as the universe, with here and there a patch of ground rudely cultivated by the hand of a lonely settler, constitute the scenery for thousands of miles contiguous to this matchless stream. As to the river itself, I shall not attempt a description of it. What has already been said proves its magnitude to be immensely great. Even some of its branches, as the Ohio and the Missouri, are to be classed among the largest rivers in the world. The former is noted for its being very muddy, and hurrying in its ungovernable career vast quantities of floating timber, which, decayed by age or other causes, fall into it so as often to render it dangerous for the steamers to pass along. Footnote: the river here alluded to is obviously the Missouri rather than the Ohio. End of footnote. Of these, the Mississippi contains acres that, coming from above, have in the lapse of years gradually settled together in places where the current is least active. Proceeding with my narrative, I must confess I liked the packet much better than I expected. We had engaged to find our own provisions, but on account of their cheapness, or partly because I had acted the part of a matron to such as needed my assistance, we were frequently presented with young fowls, coffee, rice, etc., so that our food cost us very little on the river. During this transit, we obtained considerable information respecting Illinois, which tended in some degree to lessen our disquietude. We were nevertheless very far from being at ease. Our unsettled condition was ever the uppermost on our thoughts, and shed a settled gravity over our conduct. Whilst thus the subjects of painful uncertainty, we were one night much alarmed by the following attempt to rob us. My husband and I were in our berths. I was fast asleep, but he was awake, musing upon our situation, when a black man, one of the crew, knowing we were going to settle in the country, and thinking no doubt we should have money with us, came to the side of our berths and began to search under my pillow, so softly indeed as not to awake me. He was going to examine under my husband's likewise, but he was awake. He told him he could get him anything he wanted. Such unexpected kindness was immediately understood, and the villain disappeared in a moment. Although this attempt proved a complete failure, we were induced to give up our money to the captain the following day, which we kept till we arrived at St. Louis. As my husband kept the money under his pillow, I have never looked back on this circumstance but with feelings of gratitude to Almighty God for his protecting providence. For had he succeeded, we should have been in a most miserable situation, not even able to reach the end of our journey, destitute and penniless in a strange land, without friends and without home. The time occupied in passing from New Orleans to St. Louis was about 12 days. We reached the latter place about noon, and found another steamer ready to convey us forward to the situation at which we proposed to remain. I had little opportunity of surveying the town, and therefore can say little respecting it, but was somewhat surprised to find that this noted city should be built principally of wood, Its situation is not the most eligible as it regards health, being near the confluence of the Missouri and the Illinois. It is, however, on that account likely to become a large and wealthy city, and it is indeed by some described as such already. Footnote. Although St. Louis dates from 1764, the increase in population was extremely slow for several decades. Upon incorporation as a city in 1823, there were only a few hundred inhabitants. By 1830, the year prior to Mrs. Burland's visit, the number had increased to almost 5,000. 100 years later, in 1930, the U.S. Census revealed a population of 821,960, amply fulfilling the forecast of the humble English immigrant of 1831. End of footnote. On entering the second steamer, I found I had made a poor exchange. The weather was beginning to feel uncommonly chill, and our accommodations was here very inferior, so that we felt exceedingly anxious to be at our journey's end. The place at which we intended to leave the river was not more than 120 miles from St. Louis. We therefore comforted ourselves with the idea that we should soon be there. We were finally to disembark at Phillips Ferry, according to the directions sent by the aforementioned Mr. B. to his brother. We should then be within 2 miles of his residence. Mr. B., therefore, and Phillips Ferry occupied our thoughts almost to the exclusion of every other subject. We had already traveled nearly 7,000 miles. Our food had been principally dried provisions. For many long weeks we had been oppressed with anxious suspense. There is therefore no cause for wonder that, jaded and worn out as we were, we felt anxious to be at our destined situation. Our inquiries of the sailors, how much further we had to go, almost exhausted their patience. Already we had been on the vessel 24 hours, when just at nightfall the packet stopped. A little boat was lowered into the water, and we were invited to collect our luggage and descend into it, as we were at Phillips Ferry. We were utterly confounded. There was no appearance of a landing place, no luggage yard, nor even a building of any kind within sight. We, however, attended to our directions, and in a few minutes we saw ourselves standing by the brink of the river, bordered by a dark wood, with no one near to notice us or tell us where we might procure accommodation or find a harbor. Footnote. Phillips Ferry is still conducted on or near the original site at Valley City, where the present editor utilized it late in the month of August, 1936. The ferry was established by Garrett Van Dusen in 1822, who 2 years later transferred it to Nimrod Phillips. The latter had come from Kentucky to Pike County about 1821. He died here a decade later. By his will, made in 1826, he bequeathed the ferry to his son, Andrew. This document, still on file in the courthouse at Pittsfield, we copy in full for the entertainment of the reader. Illinois, Pike County, in the name of God, amen. I, Nimrod Phillips, of the state and county aforesaid, intend to travel, and not knowing but I may die before I return, to make this my last will and testament. First, I give to Zerelda Jean, my youngest child, 5 head of cattle, a cow called Cherry, and her calves, a horse called Jack, 3 beds and furniture, and all the kitchen furniture and utensils. This I give to my youngest child, by Nancy Phillips. Nancy Norris Zerelda Jean Phillips is her name. I give to Nancy Phillips, my wife, 1 loom and its furniture, 3 breeding sows and their pigs, 6 barrows for her meat. She is to have her choice of the above-named hogs. She is to live where I now live at the ferry. My part of the crop of corn that has been on the place this year to be hers. She is to live on the place until Zerelda is of age and have the benefit of the improved land. Zerelda is to have $6 for 3 years' schooling, $18. I give to Elizabeth Elledge, my oldest daughter, $1. The rest of my estate and property is to be equally divided between my 3 children, Andrew Phillips, Selah Phillips, Asa Phillips, except Andrew is to have the ferry. This is my last will and testament. End of footnote. This happened, as before intimated, as the evening shades were rapidly settling on the earth, and the stars through the clear blue atmosphere were beginning to twinkle. It was in the middle of November, and already very frosty. My husband and I looked at each other until we burst into tears, and our children, observing our disquietude, began to cry bitterly. Is this America? Thought I. Is this the reception I meet with after my long, painfully anxious and bereaving voyage? In vain did we look around us, hoping to see a light in some distant cabin. It was not, however, the time to weep. My husband determined to leave us with our luggage in search of a habitation, and wished us to remain where we then stood until he returned. Such a step I saw to be necessary, but how trying! Should he lose himself in the wood, thought I, what will become of me and my helpless offspring? He departed. I was left with 5 young children, the youngest at my breast. When I survey this portion of my history, it looks more like fiction than reality, yet it is the precise situation in which I was then placed. After my husband was gone, I caused my 4 eldest children to sit together on one of our beds, covered them from the cold as well as I could, and endeavored to pacify them. I then knelt on the bare ground and committed myself and the little ones to the Father of mercies, beseeching him to be a lantern to my feet, a light unto my path, and to establish my goings. I rose from my knees considerably comforted, and endeavored to wait with patience the return of my husband. Above me was the chill blue canopy of heaven, a wide river before me, and a dark wood behind. The first sound we heard was that of 2 dogs that came barking towards us, so as greatly to increase our alarm. The dogs came up to us, but did us no harm, and very soon I beheld my dear husband, accompanied by a stranger, who conducted us to his habitation, whither our luggage was shortly afterwards removed in a wagon. My husband had followed a sort of cattle track, which led him to the house, which had been concealed by trees and underwood growing around it. And now, for the first time in my life, did I fairly see the interior of a log house, which, however rude I might think it, I felt, as the reader will readily believe, most happy to enter. It was much more comfortable to sleep on a bed laid on the floor before a fire of glowing embers than it would have been on the cold ground, which a short time before I feared would be my lodging. The following morning, after a comfortable night's repose, we felt our health and spirits improved. My husband began to examine the soils and produce of the country, and I to collect what information I could respecting American housewifery, manners, religion, etc. Our hostess was a little woman, exceedingly fond of smoking, as the Americans generally are, particularly the females. Before leaving England, I had heard a great deal said in behalf of American hospitality, but these encomiums certainly require to be qualified. They are exceedingly hospitable to gentlemen who may be making a tour, likewise amongst themselves as neighbors, but when they know a person really must trouble them, they appear to be aware they are conferring a favor and expect an equivalent. The little lady I have been describing knew little of generosity. We understood very soon that we should be expected to pay for our harbor, although we used our own provisions. I am forgetting that on one occasion she generously told me I might give my children the broth in which she had boiled some cabbage, if I thought they would drink it. I told her they had not been accustomed to such fare. We remained here 3 days, during which I became tolerably conversant in the theory of American housekeeping, and as Mrs. Phillips, that was the name of our hostess, was very loquacious, she initiated me into the peculiarities of Illinois politeness. Footnote. The will of Nimrod Phillips seems to indicate that the Mrs. Phillips whom Mrs. Burlend knew was a second wife of Nimrod, whose maiden name was Nancy Norris. Of her we have learned nothing apart from the vivacious picture limned by our author. An earlier wife of Phillips, who was a member of the Elledge family, intermarried with the Boones, and on coming to Illinois settled in Scott County on the east side of the Illinois River from Pike. End of footnote. No person, however slender his pretensions to knighthood, or how long soever the time since his small clothes were new, is addressed without the courteous epithet of Sir. And this practice is observed by the members of the same family in their intercourse with each other. Of course, the females are in like manner honored with Madam, ubi tu caius ego kai. It is not etiquette in Illinois to sit at the table after you have done eating. To remain after you have finished your meal implies that you have not had sufficient. This custom I subsequently found a very convenient one. But I am forgetting the house. It was a fair specimen of a log house, and therefore a description of it will give the reader a pretty correct idea of the American peasantry. There were 2 rooms, both on the ground floor, separated from each other with boards so badly joined that crevices were in many places observable. The rooms were nearly square, and might contain from 30 to 40 square yards each. Beneath one of the rooms was a cellar, the floor and the sides which were mud and clay, as left when first dug out. The walls of the house consisted of layers of strong blocks of timber, roughly squared and notched into each other at the corners, the joints filled up with clay. The house had 2 doors, one of which is always closed in winter and open in summer to cause a draught. The fire was on the floor at the end of the building, where a very grotesque chimney had been constructed of stones gathered out of the land, and walled together with clay and mud instead of cement. It was necessarily a great width to prevent the fire from communicating with the building. The house was covered with oak shingles, that is to say, thin riven boards nailed upon each other, so as just to overreach. The floors of the house were covered with the same material, except a large piece near the fire, which was paved with small stones, also gathered from the land. There was no window to the house I am describing, although many log houses may now be found having glass windows. This inconvenience I pointed out to my hostess, who replied, "Upon the whole, it was as well without, for in winter the house was warmer, and in summer they had always the door open, which was better than any window." It is in reality true that the want of light is felt very little in a log house. In winter they are obliged to keep fine blazing fires, which, in addition to light obtained from their low wide chimneys, enable the inmates to perform any business that is requisite. It is, however, by no means to be understood that an American log house equals in comfort and conveniences a snug English cottage. It is quite common to see at least one bed in the same room as that in which the fire is kept, a practice which invariably gives both the bed and the house a filthy appearance. There was no chamber, only a sort of loft, constructed rather with a view to make the house warmer than to afford additional room. Adjoining one side were a few boards nailed together in the form of a table, and supported principally by the timber in the wall. This was dignified with the name sideboard. In the center of the room stood another small table, covered with a piece of coarse brown calico. This was the dining table. The chairs, 4 in number, were the most respectable furniture in the house, having the bark of hickory plaited for bottoms. Besides these were 2 stools and a bench for common use, a candlestick made from an ear of Indian corn, 2 or 3 trenchers, and a few tin drinking vessels. One corner of the house was occupied with agricultural implements, consisting of large hoes, axes, etc., for stubbing, called in America grubbing, flails, and wooden forks, all exhibiting specimens of workmanship rather homely. Various herbs were suspended from the roof with a view of being medicinally serviceable. Also 2 guns, one of them a rifle. There were also several hams and sides of bacon, smoked almost till they were black, 2 or 3 pieces of beef, etc. Under one of the beds were 3 or 4 large pots filled with honey, of which Mrs. P. was not a little lavish, as she used it to every meal along with coffee. The furniture in the other room consisted of 2 beds and a hand loom, with which the family wove the greater part of their own clothes. In the cellar I observed 2 or 3 large hewn tubs, full of lard, and a lump of tobacco, the produce of their own land, in appearance sufficient to serve an ordinary smoker his life. During our sojourn at Mr. Phillip's, my husband found Mr. B., and on the 3rd day after arrival brought that gentleman's team, 2 stiff oxen yoked to a clumsy sledge, on which we placed our beds, boxes, etc., and bid good-bye to Mrs. P., who, as we paid her for our harbor, contrived to shed a tear or two at the thoughts of parting. After arriving at Mr. B.'s house, I certainly felt we had been a little cajoled. My husband had seen him the day before, but had made no mention of his condition. He was in the fields when we arrived, but as the door was unlocked, or rather lockless, we took the liberty of introducing ourselves and luggage. Mr. B. was at once a bachelor and solitaire. He had left England precipitately, and what is more unusual, a great part of his money, which at this time he was daily expecting by a remittance. The property he had taken with him was all expended in land and cattle, so that a little money was a desideratum. Shortly after our arrival, Mr. B. made his appearance, which, as I before intimated, was rather mysterious. In his letters sent to England, he had spoken of his situation as a land flowing with milk and honey. But I assure you, patient reader, his appearance would have led anyone to suppose that he gathered his honey rather from thorns than flowers. He was verily as ragged as a sheep, too much so for decency to describe, and his house was more like the cell of a hermit who aims at super-excellence by enduring privations than the cottage of an industrious peasant. The bed on which he slept was only like a bolster, which he had used on shipboard, and laid upon a kind of shelf of his own constructing. Then again the walls of his house were of hewn timber as others, but the joinings or interstices were left quite open. The first night I passed in this miserable abode I was almost perished. My husband was obliged to heat a flat iron, and after wrapping it in flannel, apply it to my feet. So little were we protected from the inclemency of the weather. Finding our comforts here so few, we determined to have a home of our own as soon as possible. Mr. B was too busy on his farm to render my husband much assistance in selecting a piece of ground. Besides, the condition of his eau de choses rendered it almost imperative upon him to keep near at home, especially as he was a bachelor. Footnote, eau de choses meaning his trousers. Before I proceed any further with my narrative, perhaps it will be of advantage to the reader to explain the method of purchasing land in the United States. The land in the various states has all been surveyed by direction of the government, and divided into portions of 80 acres each. For the sale of the land thus surveyed and laid down on large plans, a land office is established in various central situations, where all the allotments of a certain district are sold and the purchasers' names registered. Any person, therefore, who wishes to purchase one or more of these subsections can see the plan and select any that are unsold. They will even sell as such small a quantity as 40 acres, but as they do this merely to accommodate new settlers, no person already possessing 80 acres can purchase a smaller quantity than that at a time. In some of the older states, the government lands are all sold off. It must there be bought of private owners, but in Illinois and other new states, there is plenty unsold. The government price everywhere is $100 for 80 acres. As there are myriads of acres, yet in its native luxuriant wildness, any person may with impunity cultivate as much as he chooses without paying anything. And as a further inducement, when a person begins thus to cultivate, no other person can legally purchase that land till 4 years have expired from the time of his beginning to cultivate. By obtaining what is termed as a preemption, the improvement arising from his own industry is as secure to him for 4 years as if he were the actual owner. Should, however, he fail to pay for the land before the term expires, an indifferent person may then purchase it, but this seldom happens. Every person purchasing land at the office must declare upon oath, if required, that no other party has an improvement on it, and if it be proved to be otherwise, such purchase is in every case invalid, and the fraudulent party liable to a heavy fine. An improved 80 acres was the first land we purchased. We obtained it in the following manner. A person named Mr. Oakes, having heard that a family about to settle was sojourning at Mr. B.'s, came to invite my husband to buy some venison, which he had killed with his rifle just before. My husband went with him, and in conversation found he was disposed to sell his improvement right, for the 4 years were not expired, and he had not entered it at the land office. For this right he wanted $60. My husband told him he would call upon him the next day, and returned to Mr. B.'s after buying a quantity of nice venison at a halfpenny per pound. The following day, my husband and I visited Mr. Oakes, who took us round the estate, showed us the boundaries, which were marked out by large stones set at each corner, termed the cornerstones. Footnote. There were commonly 3 waves of migration in the settlement of any given portion of the frontier. First of all came the traders, hunters, and trappers, with no particular intention of improving the country. Second came the squatters, who occupied, without troubling to buy a legal title, a tract of land and made some slight improvements on it, frequently building a cabin and reducing 1 or more acres to cultivation, but relying largely upon hunting and on the natural products of the forest for their support. In the wake of the squatter came the permanent settler, who acquired legal title to the soil and developed a home with the intention of passing it on to his children. Oakes, the individual here noted, was evidently a squatter, who has left no record of his sojourn in the community. Of him and his kind, Mr. Jess M. Thompson, local historian, observes, all seem to have vanished from the community at an early day. End of footnote. On the land there were about 400 sugar maples, which Mr. Oakes had tapped the preceding year. These trees grow plentifully in the United States and promise with proper culture to supersede the use of the West Indian sugar in America. They like a low situation and a deep soil, and grow to a larger size than any trees in this country. They are said to thrive the better the oftener they are pierced. The method of obtaining sugar from them is fairly simple. A small cabin, or as it is there termed, camp, is built in the midst of the trees. 2 or 3 large coppers, holding from 5 to 10 gallons each, are set within it to boil the liquor, which, being drained from the trees into hewn wooden troughs, is carried into the camp. The incisions are made with an auger in the beginning of March, when the sap is beginning to rise. Into each of these holes a tube is inserted, about an inch in diameter, so as just to fill the hole. Through this the liquor flows as through a spout. The tree from which these tubes are made is admirably adapted for the purpose, growing somewhat like the elder, only its branches are straighter and contain more pith. It is usually called in Illinois the shoemaker's tree. Its botanical name I do not know. Footnote. Apparently the co-author of Mrs. Burlend's narrative nodded here. The tree in question is the sumac. The most suitable weather for the discharge of this liquor is when the days are fine and the nights are frosty. After the liquor is thus collected, it is boiled down to the consistency of a thin treacle. It is then strained through a coarse woolen cloth and afterwards boiled again at a slower fire till it becomes hard and firm like raw sugar. It is at present much used in the United States, and always sells at a higher rate than that from the West Indies. On the land now under consideration, Mr. Oakes had broken up about 12 acres, 3 of which were sown with wheat, and the remaining 9 ready to be sown with Indian corn, oats, etc., the following spring. As we liked the situation and land very much and were wishful to be settled, the agreement was completed that evening and the money paid and possession obtained the following day. The reader is aware that the $60 given to Mr. Oakes were only for his house, improvement right, sugar-making utensils, etc. 100 more we paid at the land office at Quincy, and we obtained the usual certificate or title deeds, and thus by the 1st of December, having spent about 30 pounds in traveling, 35 more in land, etc., we were the rightful owners of a farm of 80 acres with a log house in the center of it. What more could we require? The reader will perceive in the next chapter. Footnote. The farm which the immigrants thus obtained for their home is legally known as the northwest quarter of the northeast quarter of Section 6, Township 5, south, right to west of the 4th p.m. It lies about 2 miles east of Bethel Cemetery and about 3 miles north of the village of Detroit in northwestern Detroit Township.